Good Shabbos. In Pirkei Avot, also known as Ethics of the Fathers, Chapters of the Fathers, or Sayings of the Sages, Pirkei Avot, Chapter 5, Mishnah 17, it reads, "Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure." Sometimes it's translated, "Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will be constructive, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not be constructive." What sort of controversy is an example of one for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy or the argument between Hillel and Shammai. Which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. This week, we read in the Torah about Korach. And one little explanation first to explain a little of this. One reading of a dispute that is for the sake of heaven is where two people are arguing with each other, but not against each other, for the sake of understanding some greater truth. Whereas the motivation could be a little different for the argument that's not for the sake of heaven. More ego-centered, perhaps, more about who's better, who's smarter. But about Hillel and Shammai, which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. In the Talmud, in Eruvin, Masechet Eruvin, 13b, Rabbi Abba said, in the name of Shmuel, "For 3 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed. This one said, the halacha is in accordance with our opinion. And the other one said, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those, both are the words of the living God. However, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of the house of Hillel." The Gemara asks, the Gemara is a part of the Talmud where all this gets hashed out. The Gemara asks, since both these and these are the words of the living God, why was the house of Hillel privileged to have the halacha established in accordance with their position? The reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted. And when they taught the halacha, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of the house of Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they prioritized the statements of the house of Shammai to their own statements in deference to the house of Shammai. That is, they quoted the statements of the house of Shammai before they quoted their own statements. So, according to this, we follow the house of Hillel more often than not, because the house of Hillel was more respectful, was more agreeable, was more forbearing. They offered more dignity to the people with whom they were in discussion. Not because they were more right. They both were the words of the living God, but the character of the way the house of Hillel treated others was better. And presumably then they didn't make it about who was better, who was smarter. They made it about what is a greater truth, what is a greater justice. Now we come to Korach. Korach is not depicted in the same way. So in the Torah this week, beginning chapter 16 of Numbers, Korach, the son of Itzar, the son of Kohat, the son of Levi, so he's a Levite, betook himself along with Datan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Pelat, descendants of Reuben, to rise up against Moses. Hear that, to rise up against Moses, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community. It's princes of the community, are some translations, chosen in the assembly, men of repute. They combined against Moses and Aaron and said to them, they said to Moses and Aaron, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above the congregation?" So Korach organized a general uprising of these leaders to say to Moses and Aaron, "What do you think makes you so great that you're doing all of this?" And when Moses heard this, he fell on his face. That's pretty much the translation. Bipol al panav. He like that's an expression of humility and maybe discouragement also. Then he spoke to Korach and all his company, saying, "Come morning, the Lord will make known who is God's and who is holy, and will grant him access to God's self. God will grant access to the one God has chosen. Do this, you, Korach, and all your band, take fire pans, and tomorrow put fire in them and lay incense on them before the Lord. Then the man whom the Lord chooses, he shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi," repeating back more or less Korach's words to Moses. Moses said further to Korach, "Hear me, sons of Levi. Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has set you apart from the community of Israel and given you access to God to perform the duties of the Lord's tabernacle and to minister to the community and serve them?" They were Levites. The Levites were all set aside to serve in the temple. Is it not enough that you already have been given a special position among all the people of Israel? Now that God has advanced you and all your fellow Levites with you, do you seek the priesthood too? Truly, it is against the Lord that you and all your company have banded together. For who is Aaron that you should rail against him? Aaron, who is the father of the priests. And Moses sent for Datan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, who were one of those who rose up with Korach. But they said, "We will not come. Is it not enough that you brought us from a land?" Get this. "Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, but that you would also lord it over us? Even if you had brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey and given us possession of fields and vineyards, should you gouge out those men's eyes? We will not come." Moses was much aggrieved, and he said to the Lord, "Pay no attention to their calls. I have not taken one animal of any of them, nor have I wronged any one of them." So you see, Moses sends for Datan and Abiram, and they refuse to come. And not only that, they say, "Look, you took us from a land, you took us from such riches, you took us from such a place of privilege. You took us out of Egypt, out of this land flowing with milk and honey. And even if you had brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, that wouldn't have been good enough." So it's almost like it's not about the facts at all. It's not about any of the issues at all. It's about it seems to be some type of personal attack. Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation, says Pirkei Avot. A dispute that's for the sake of heaven, it's like that of Hillel and Shammai. A dispute which is not for the sake of heaven, it's like that which is of Korach and his congregation. Torah study is based on disputation, on argument, clashing one truth against another to gain clarity on truth itself. This is especially so because so much of what we call religious truth is greater than ourselves. We cannot clearly see the answers to everything. So we hold more than one truth together at the same time and then use each of them to inquire into each other. This requires that we hold respect for each other, that we do not sink to arguing against each other, but rather we're arguing with each other towards learning truth that is greater than any of us. To take a negative example from politics of a while ago, in the 1990s, we began to hear a phrase, the politics of personal destruction, where political arguments would be about destroying the character of your opponent rather than striving to find the best way to govern. We must avoid arguments of personal destruction and instead focus on arguments of communal improvement. We need to argue about what is best for the community, and to do this best, we need to make room for each other, each to be ourselves, and each to put forth our strongest argument. For what the other person has to say may be something we need to hear. In the Zohar Chadash, this is kind of a mystical manuscript, a mystical text that's woven into the Zohar, states that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, and that these correspond to the 600,000 souls of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people that come out of Egypt. And another text, the Megillah Amukos, in there it is written that the soul of every Jew stems from one of those 600,000 letters in the Torah. So Midrash teaches that the soul of each person who received Torah at Sinai, the soul of each of us, was actually there at Sinai to hear it. Each of us was there. Each of us received our Torah there. And Rabbi Michael Strassfeld, a Reconstructionist rabbi, who was also one of the editors of the Jewish Catalog way back in the 1970s, maybe some of you remember that. But Rabbi Michael Strassfeld suggests, on the basis of the teaching of the 600,000 letters, that each one of us received a letter at Sinai. Each one of us, or perhaps are a letter in the Torah. Each of us is carrying with us one letter that came out of Sinai. Without each of us, without the Torah that each of us heard, without the perspective that each of us brings and the learning from the experience that each of us has, the Torah itself is incomplete. We need to know each other's insights if any of us are to be complete. We need to hear each other's insights if there's going to be shalom in the world. Shalom as in peace, but also as in shleimut, completeness. We need to hear with completeness if there is to be peace. Last week, I read an article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the headline of which was, "Mixed cities were burning all over Israel last month, but not this one. Here's why." By mixed cities, they mean cities where there was a mixture of Jewish and Arab populations. So mixed cities were burning all over Israel last month, but not this one. Here's why. And the article featured a close look at a town called Nof HaGalil, which means a view of the Galil. It actually, until recently, was called Upper Nazareth. And it is originally a Jewish town built on the hilltop above Nazareth, Nazareth being the largest Arab city in the Galilee. Nof HaGalil is one of the communities I visited in 2018 when I was in Israel. We met with people there who live in the educational kibbutz in town, the educational kibbutz. A kibbutz, as you may know, is a collective where the members of the people, each person is a member, and they effectively, they share income and share expenses. And most kibbutzim are rather sizable farms, but some more recently created kibbutzim are urban kibbutzim. They are actually in the city, and their business is not agriculture. Usually their business is education. So you have a whole kibbutz, a whole communal gathering, a communal neighborhood of people, a collective where people are involved in education. And there is one such educational kibbutz in Nof HaGalil, which did not see any riots during this last clash. And the major reason, according to the article, that they gave for the lack of violence in Nof HaGalil was that there is a core of leaders in the town, including the members of the educational kibbutz, but not only them. There were a core of leaders who are intent on peace. And they went out of their way at the time to maintain the peace during the recent period of crisis. As opposed to another example in another town where I visited. I also visited Lod. Lod, there clearly were people intent on disrespect and violence. And that's what they got. Nof HaGalil is also where Israel's only chocolate factory is located, but I suspect that that was not the reason for the calm. Rather, this is an example of how a community can benefit from a core of committed leaders intent on peaceful coexistence. I don't think it was the chocolate factory. This is how we should situate ourselves as a core of committed people intent on peaceful coexistence. We are fortunate that here in Greater Harrisburg, we have networks of people we can be part of that are intent upon peace. It is also true that within Israel and in the Jewish diaspora, there are networks of people intent upon peace and coexistence. And it is vital that people like us do what we can to connect more and more of those networks, to amplify the voices of those who are intent upon peace, dignity, and peaceful coexistence, so that there can be more examples like Nof HaGalil rather than examples like Lod. By way of conclusion, the page Eruvin 13b in the Talmud, which I began to read from, continues a little bit here, where it said, that the house of Hillel, the teaching, the halakha, is established in accordance with the house of Hillel because they were agreeable and forbearing. They showed restraint when affronted. When they taught halakha, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of the house of Shammai. And the Talmud continues, this is to teach you that anyone who humbles themselves, the Holy Blessed One exalts them. And anyone who exalts themselves, the Holy Blessed One humbles them. Anyone who seeks greatness, greatness flees from them. And conversely, anyone who flees from greatness, greatness seeks them. Anyone who attempts to force the moment and expends great effort to achieve and objective precisely when they desire to do so, the moment forces them to, and they are unsuccessful. And conversely, anyone who is patient and yields to the moment stands by their side and ultimately makes them successful. The sages taught, following from an earlier teaching, for 2.5 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed. One said it would have been preferable had all of humanity not been created, rather than for humanity to have been created. And the other said it is preferable that humanity had been created, rather than humanity had not been created. Ultimately, the opinions were counted and concluded. They concluded it would have been preferable had human beings not been created, rather than that they had been created. However, now that we have been created, we should examine our actions and seek to correct them. Shabbat Shalom.